So Sarah Bonfim is a PhD student from Unicamp in Brazil. She's a New Voices member and also part of the project Block Malars na Philosophia. I'm not speaking Brazilian, I'm so sorry. So I think it's a Brazilian blog on women philosophers. Today her talk is entitled Beyond Rights of Women, the Experience of Dependence in Mary Wollstonecraft. And the floor is here.
Thank you, Jill. It's Mulheres na Filosofia. But yeah, it's the word just right. So it's a real pleasure to be here today. And in this paper, I have the goal to present how Wollstonecraft portrays the experience of dependence in her early books, namely Thoughts on the Education of Daughters, Original Stories from Real Life, and Mary a Fiction. The plan is, first, I'll introduce the books and their characteristics. Then I'll introduce the problem of women's dependence. In the following, I'll introduce two ideas very quickly: the proper lady stereotype and Rousseau's Sophie. The next step is to go through the books, shedding light on the experience of a woman who suffers from dependence in every field of life. So contextualizing the books and talk about the experience of dependence. The very first publication of Wollstonecraft, Thoughts on the Education of Daughters, with reflections on female conduct in the more important duties of life. It was released on 1786. In this work, we can notice the perennial themes of Wollstonecraft's work: women's intellectual development and the urge to reevaluate how women were treated and socialized in society. Using a reactionary framework, Wollstonecraft subverts it, presenting a new idea about what a proper lady should be. She recommends behaviors that were not very common to female readers, such as stating their own opinion about literature and not giving marriage so early in life. In other words, Wollstonecraft imagines other possibilities for female existence. The second book, Original Stories from Real Life, with conversations calculated to regulate the affections and form the mind to truth and goodness, was published in 1787. It is a children's book with tales that sketch out the education of two young girls, the sisters Mary and Caroline. Another important character is Mrs. Mason, the housekeeper responsible for girls' education. Mrs. Mason's role is to create situations to teach the young girls how to behave and pursue in case of distress. I can say in advance that she teaches Mary and Caroline to follow the path of virtue, even if it's difficult. Teaching girls positive virtues is the great innovation of original stories. The third book, Mary a Fiction, is a romance with biographical elements. Beforehand, Wollstonecraft informs the readers that she attempts to develop a character different from those generally portrayed. In short, Wollstonecraft's aim in this book is to offer other femininity possibilities analogous to those she has experienced for herself. When she says a character different, Wollstonecraft forges a heroine who tries to go beyond the strictly feminine model. The main character is called Mary, and she can discuss subjects such as politics and literature. Also, the heroine Mary loves to read and can recognize her limitations even when fighting against them. Mary a Fiction could be read as an exemplification of Vindication of the Rights of a Woman, meaning that Wollstonecraft explores what she was thinking about and planning for women through examples and situations. In the following, I continue to present some contextual facts that will help us understand the idea that I work on today, the experience of dependence. I'll explain the first principles to demonstrate how liberty is one of the cornerstones of Wollstonecraft's project that includes the improvement of reason and virtue in humans' lives. To demonstrate that the condition of women is an injustice in the rights of women, Wollstonecraft presents a principle which will guide her arguments for women's emancipation. The conceptions of reason, virtue, and knowledge compose what she calls first or glorious principles. Wollstonecraft understands reason as the simple power of improvement, or properly speaking, the power of discerning the truth. Virtue can be understood as the end goal of human rationality and distinguishes a person from another based on actions. Knowledge results from combining experience and the association of ideas that grow lifelong. Working together, these conceptions play an essential role in searching for the simple truth. Wollstonecraft explains the principle in the following, and I quote, "In what does man's preeminence over the brute creation consist? The answer is as clear as that half is less than the whole, in reason. What acquisition exalts one being above another? Virtue, with spontaneous reply. For what purpose were the passions implanted? That men, by struggling with them, might attain a degree of knowledge denied to the brutes, whispers experience. End of quote. This principle provides a basis for Wollstonecraft to construct her vindication universally and abstractly. She combined these principal elements to challenge the established social order. Society had failed to build parity between the sexes, and at the same time, it instigates other injustices, such as social and economical inequality. Interestingly, Wollstonecraft's approach to female liberty takes under consideration everyday problems. In my view, this is exactly the strength of Wollstonecraft's approach to liberty. She does not spare efforts to report the experience of the dependent to her readers. When Wollstonecraft sheds light on the human condition, especially about women, she reveals the effects of dependence that go under deep social layers. For example, in the third chapter of Vindication of the Rights of Women, Wollstonecraft diagnoses that the habits taught to young girls lead them to sedentarism. The consequence is a weaker body due to a lack of exercise and movement since childhood. According to Wollstonecraft's observation, a weak body means a weak mind. What Wollstonecraft addresses is the type of woman that, instead of developing rationality and virtues, wrap themselves in bands and become slaves by their own sick and frail bodies. In this case, sickness gains prominence and becomes usual and prevail as an obstacle to the improvement of reason. Besides the constitution of male body, Wollstonecraft calls attention to the lack of autonomy since childhood. Since they are little, girls are always under supervision and they don't learn about self-conservation, which, according to Wollstonecraft, is one of the early natural exercise of thought. Women are dependent because they learn it to be, just switching the dependence between their parents, tutors, and husbands. Women got stuck in this dependent cycle their whole life and are incapable of improving reason. Consequently, this situation keeps them apart from the possibilities of emancipation. Questions could be raised, such as how could women be free without proper rights and not knowing their duties? How could women be free without the proper ways to guarantee their economic reliability? The hypothesis that arises from these questions is that women's social dependence results from the lack of education at home and school. Wollstonecraft's point here is that women didn't learn how to behave for themselves in situations in life that demanded agency and problem solving. Wollstonecraft is interested in guaranteeing women's rights and making women understand their duties. Also, when women live as dependent wives or daughters, they will never be able to live the experience of being free, neither their society. About the experience of dependence, Lena Haldenius has a significant contribution. The scholar emphasizes that Wollstonecraft is a philosopher concerned with real-life issues. Haldenius sheds light on Wollstonecraft's concern about social vulnerability that keeps women apart from inheritance and stable, well-paid jobs. And I quote Haldenius. Wollstonecraft explores, if you will, the phenomenological context of living unfreely by asking not only what freedom is, but also what is it like? What is it like to live at mercy of another? What does that do to you? Wollstonecraft defends Republican principles, but believes that a true understanding of what is it to be free, why anarchy is bad, and how inequality works can only come through experience. End of quote. What Haldenius calls the phenomenological content of living unfreely is the matter of thoughts on the education, original stories, and merry fiction as a reward. Wollstonecraft does not work with suppositions or abstract scenarios. Quite contrary. In these books, Wollstonecraft portrays real situations that probably she closely observed or lived for herself. Also, she draws political consequences not only for women but also for society. In the following, I continue my conference plan and present how Wollstonecraft portrays women who live unfreely. First, I introduce two ideas very quickly, the proper lady stereotype and Rousseau's Sophie as an example. These ideas are important for two reasons. They serve as a background standard to the model of women that Wollstonecraft addresses and present how this idea of a proper lady was portrayed in theory books. Whether in Thoughts on the Education, original stories, or Mary fiction, Wollstonecraft mobilizes issues that she would go deeper in rights of women, namely the female education, the association of ideas, and the consequences of the lack of recent improvement. Like the rational descenders, Wollstonecraft credits to education the principles of her metaphysical framework and the possibility of social change. In other words, alongside education, a revolution on female matters would create possibilities to build a fair society based on virtues. However, ongoing femininity models prevent women from achieving solid virtues. For example, dependence was considered a natural aspect of femininity, such as the proper lady idea. According to Mary Wollstonecraft, the proper lady is a popular stereotype between the 17th and 18th centuries, disseminated mostly by conduct books. Some characteristics were considered inherently feminine, such as modesty and obedience. Besides that, proper lady had to follow a moral and a sensibility code, and her husband should keep her under this strict code. For example, in the first pages of Emile or On Education, Rousseau sketches an ideal proper lady named Sophie, a girl that soon will marry Emile. First, Jean-Jacques Rousseau describes the ideal woman to marry Emile as an obedient woman. In addition, Rousseau says that arguing for equality between the sexes is pointless because each one serves a specific end on natural plans. Among other things, Rousseau also states that men and women must form a couple in which one part is weak and passive and the other is strong and active. Keep in mind this very brief picture about Proper Lady and Rousseau's Sophie, where the dependence of women is pictured as natural. I will present an example of each one of Wollstonecraft's early books that challenged prejudices and misconceptions about women. Also, I will highlight how it feels to be under people's power. And I can anticipate that Wollstonecraft spared no effort to demonstrate how humiliating and degrading this experience is. First, let us look at the book Thoughts on the Education and see Wollstonecraft's approach to questions related to work and education for women. In the chapters Unfortunate Situation of Females, Fashionably Educated and Left Without a Fortune, and Matrimony, Wollstonecraft portrays the real impediments that arise from these situations that are part of an ordinary woman life. Let us analyze first the section about educated girls left without a fortune. Wollstonecraft addresses those girls educated according to fashionable but left without wealth or marriage. The consequence that Wollstonecraft acknowledges about these girls in this not so hypothetical situation is that they will probably remain single and need to search for alternatives for the cost of living. Regarding the possibility of earning a living for themselves, Wollstonecraft assumes that the jobs available to women, few are the modes of earning a subsistence, and those are very humiliating. These jobs that are referred as humiliating are housekeepers, company ladies, and mistresses. Especially for those ladies that will work as maids or housekeepers in their relatives' houses, Wollstonecraft upholds how embarrassing the situation can be and how it can contribute to the degradation of women. The thing is that this kind of job has layers of dependence and requires that women remain in a permanent state of discipline that compromises their rational capacities. Now, let us look at the other chapter, matrimony. Wollstonecraft begins the chapter with the following affirmation. Early marriages are, in my opinion, a stop to improvement. When she says that, she may refuse that marriage improves or is a cornerstone to female existence. She endorses marriage in a proper stage of life, which is after the 20s. Marriage must not be at the center of male life and should not be the ultimate wish. The end goal of male lives, actually all human lives, must be their duty to develop the faculty of reason and improve it. When women marry too early in life, their education is overlooked. Thinking about that, Wollstonecraft raised questions such as, how could women escape from an unhappy marriage when they do not even know how to raciocinate? Besides that, women deal with questions to get pregnant as soon as they marry. How could this woman raise virtuous children when they are stuck in childhood? What I'm trying to say here is that Wollstonecraft is not against marriage, quite contrary. In Rights of Women, she defends that family is a microcosm of the state, and what happens at home defines what can happen in the state. The domestic space of family is responsible for growing virtues that contribute to the virtue of the state. What Wollstonecraft defends is that women should have the agency to act, including deciding if they want to marry or not, and marriage must be a path to improvement, not the end. We can conclude that, besides the conservative framework of conduct books, Thoughts on the Education presents a progressive position on the development of women's rationality and social conditions. Women should have access to a better jobs and choices of getting married or not. Although Wollstonecraft does not offer much to overcome the situation, it is possible to see that she already has a plan. In a few words, Wollstonecraft begins to formulate the subjects present in all her career in Thoughts on the Education. Let us move to the analysis of original stories and girls' education. Rather than Thoughts on the Education, original stories shows more alternatives to women concerning escapes of dependence. Wollstonecraft puts all her efforts into raising an education focused on developing girls' minds and bodies. It is important to emphasize that the protagonists are two young girls, Caroline, 12 years old, and Mary, 14 years old. For that matter, the themes that compose original stories are compatible with the common conflicts in this stage of life. To the clipping suggested by this conference, I highlight two episodes present in this book. The first highlight is Mrs. Mason's speech to the youngest sisters about interdependence. According to Mrs. Mason, there are times in life when one can rely on others. It is not so bad because it's a dependence forged by the Heavenly Father and can help us call forth many virtues, exercise the best affection of the human heart, and fix them into habits. In other words, the interdependence that we can call positive promotes virtues of who helps and whom it helped. Unlike dependence, interdependence is a transitory situation and offers the possibility of personal improvement. The second episode that deserves attention is Anna Loft's case. Miss Loft is a mistress who lost her parents very young. Even though the story is very tragic, it is full of meaning. Used to a comfortable life, Miss Loft sees herself as an anguished orphan after her parents' death. Who takes care of her is an aunt that I quote, treated her as if she were a mere dependent or humbled and expected her to be a humble companion in every sense of the word. End of quote. Seeing herself in this position, Mrs. Loft will try to find a way to achieve a more dignified life, as we'll see. Comparing the interdependence and the case of Miss Loft, it is important to emphasize three things. First, about interdependence, we can comprehend it alongside Wollstonecraft's idea about society. In Rights of Women, Wollstonecraft will defend that society is the place where we can improve ourselves for the future. Thinking of Wollstonecraft's metaphysical framework, it's understandable that there are ways, such as interdependence, to develop ourselves through actions. Second, interdependence is helpful for society because the development and improvement of anyone in society counts. In Rights of Women, this is an evident fact for Wollstonecraft. Everyone in a republic must be free to guarantee that the state is also free. In this case, Miss Loft was under her aunt's domination, what compromises the liberty of all the members of her society. Third, the kind of negative dependence that Anna Loft suffers is degrading both her and the society. On one hand, Miss Loft is so dependent that it is almost impossible to escape the situation and develop her reason or have agency. On the other hand, her aunt must assume a position that is not hers. Instead of helping Miss Loft to achieve other stage of improvement, this aunt has to think in ways to keep her under domination going on. In conclusion, interdependence is a positive situation when there is someone that needs help and there is someone that can help. Contrary to the case of dependence of woman, in which it is not a specific situation but a life condition. The first, improve virtue, and the second, degrade humankind. As shown above, original stories shows more examples about the experience of dependence than thoughts on the education. Also, Wollstonecraft is more mature than the previous book, showing that she developed more of her observations about women's condition. Throughout Child Tales, Wollstonecraft teaches what she understands about dependence and why is unacceptable. As we saw, dependence no longer improves, but instead makes humankind worse. In addition, Wollstonecraft puts much credit on society concerning the improvement of human beings. Maybe that is why she has an alternative to dependence. Interdependence is an example of improving ourselves and others when we can help each other and exercise our virtues. The whole of society is to govern its and intermediate relations and promote their citizens. Moving forward, I'll present Mary Fiction, a book that Wollstonecraft uses a lot of autobiographical facts to explore how female dependence can affect who suffers from it and who is around dependent women. Compared to Thoughts on the Education and Original Stories, Mary Fiction is a book that consequences of female dependence is more evidently. Also, Wollstonecraft sheds light on the consequences around the dependent person. I'll call attention to two characters of this romance, Eliza, the mother, and Mary, the heroine. First, the book presents Eliza as a gentle, fashionable girl. According to this presentation, Eliza, and I quote, was educated with the expectation of a large fortune, of course, became a mere machine. The homage of her attendants made a significant part of her puerile amusement, and she never imagined there were any relative duties for her to fulfill. Notions of her own consequence by this means were few superficial accomplishments without any taste for them. End of quote. As a fashionable girl, Eliza was raised and educated following the pattern of the time. About marriage, who chose her husband was her father, and she readily submitted to his will and promised to love, honor, and obey a vicious fool, as in duty bound. When Eliza married Mary's father, Eliza continued to obey the same way she did with her parents, and consequently, she did not begin to think by herself. The difficulties that came with marriage were of different kinds. Domestic violence, Eliza taking care more of the animals than of her children, stillborn babies, and her nursing the nine. Only the oldest son and Mary could make it through childhood. Eliza's dependence has a strong influence in Mary's life. I highlight three consequences that show how the mother's submission impacts the daughter's development. The first consequence is directly related to Mary's education. Eliza does not carry her mother duties out. In other words, she does not prepare Mary to be a virtuous person, especially because it would be impossible. Because Eliza herself did not learn how to be this virtuous person, which includes learning to associate and have agency. A second consequence is the lack of body strength, which results from how female bodies suffer in the educational process. The result is that women, in this case, Eliza, are always sick and not feeling well, what makes it impossible to overcome her situation and try something different. The last consequence is a psychological one. Because of the absence of esteem between mother and daughter, Mary constantly feels sad and excluded. Looking now at the second character, Mary, she is refused by her mother, Eliza. Mary is raised in a natural environment and rendered to her imagination. According to the story, Mary was neglected by her family in every way possible. However, the situation turned out to be an opportunity for Mary to develop her rational faculties. After a series of tragedies, including Eliza's death, Mary stays alone, and she cannot count on any relative that could take care of her. During this struggle, the alternative is an arranged marriage. Mary's anguish about marrying a stranger is apparent throughout the book. This anguish feeling stays clear when Mary must deal with the emotions that she saw raised when she met Henry, and must deal quickly about it. After many narrator speeches about how marriage is an unfair arrangement, the romance closing phrase is, and I quote, In moments of solitary sadness, a glimpse of joy would dart across her mind. She thought she was hastening to that world where there is neither marrying nor giving marriage. End of quote. In this story, Mary is a victim of a system that makes a woman dependent. Her mother, Elisa, could not help, a sign that the cycle of dependence continues. Maybe Mary fiction is gloomier compared to thoughts of the education and original stories. What I realize in this book is the possibility to comprehend the extension of women's compulsory dependence. Compared to Rights of Women, Mary fiction can illustrate some of the affirmations that Wollstonecraft does in Rights of Women. For example, how humiliating is the dependent situation and responding to the conservative fear that women would abandon their families if they had intellectual growth. And now I conclude my speech. As I tried to argue today, the dependence has been cultivated in girls since childhood and grows in a way that prevents to be natural because there is no chance for them to develop themselves freely. Self-conservation is a vital strategy to develop early in life, and it is something naturally learned on times that does not have supervision. However, always under supervision, girls keep the dependence not only on taking care of themselves, but also on choosing understanding everything from religion to a husband. The education they receive at home or school is responsible for keeping their conditioned status quo. Dependency, as Wollstonecraft sees, is damage to women and society. This kind of approach is an exciting way to demonstrate that the collaborative role of her vindication about women's rights. The question that I conclude my speech is, how can only a tiny part of society be free if the improvement of the reason is a collective task? Thank you so much.